Welcome to How You Livin', a transformative podcast featuring best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and minister, Dr. Rick Rigsby. And now, Dr. Rick.
Hello, friends. Thanks so much for listening. We're continuing our discussion about the most profound lesson ever taught to me by my father. My dad was the wisest man I ever met in my life, yet he was just a third grade dropout. Now that sounds rather oxymoronic, that you could not possibly be that wise with that little schooling. I believe it was Mark Twain who said on one occasion, "I've never allowed my schooling to get in the way of my education." My father was the wisest person I've ever met in my life, and in fact, 3 decades ago, as I stood in front of the casket of my first wife, my father said 3 simple words that changed the trajectory of my life. My father simply stated, "Son, just stand." Simple, profound, life-changing. This is part 5 of our discussion to simply stand. My father demanded on that day, September the 12th, 1996, that I not quit, that I not give up. I had 2 little children. My wife fought courageously for nearly 6 years after being diagnosed with breast cancer. My dad did not want to see me throw in the towel. He demanded that I keep standing, even when I didn't think that I could keep going. He motivated me to keep standing, even when I wanted to give up. So here's my hope. The reason why I'm doing this series of podcasts is simply this. I hope that these words from my dad will encourage you to stand regardless of what you may be facing. This series is being recorded as we commemorate Black History Month, what I commonly refer to as American history, performed largely by all people, predominantly people of color. But this series is being commemorated during February, which actually kicked off with the observance of the birthday of slain civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. back in January. Martin Luther King stood for racial equality. Martin Luther King stood for social justice. One man standing, and his courage influenced an entire generation and continues to influence this very day. And King's life, I believe, can be summed up in one word: stand. You know, throughout the history of the United States, many have stood. Even when it wasn't convenient to stand or even popular to stand, many have stood. From our Revolutionary War times, we have heroes like Nathaniel Greene. He was known as the second best general during the Revolutionary War. Of course, the best is reserved for our first president, George Washington. How about Crispus Attucks? He's regarded as the first American killed in the Boston Massacre. He was a whaler. He was a sailor of African descent. He was sold out to the cause. How about Paul Revere or Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin? They all stood. How about Patrick Henry? I recall Patrick Henry, like you do as well, speaking at the Virginia Convention in 1775, advocating for American independence from Britain, when he famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Many Native Americans stood for justice and equality. How about Sitting Bull, who resisted white settlement on Native lands? How about Chief Wilma Mankiller? That's right, Wilma Mankiller. She was the first female Cherokee chief. She fought for tribal rights. How about Chief Standing Bear? He fought to believe, to challenge, to do everything he could to convince the larger society that Native Americans were persons with legal rights. It's a fight we're still fighting this very day. Prior to, during, and after the Civil War, many stood on both sides. Many stood to support slavery, but there were those opposing views that could not be ignored as well. I'm talking about abolitionists like John Brown, Nat Turner, Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. Women also stood in an era that said women should not stand. You have Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. There was even a white Southern woman who stood against slavery. Her name, Angelina Grimke. She was a real hero, is a real hero of mine. Angelina Grimke. Remember that name. Look her up. She was such a threat to America's established order of slavery that she was known as, quote, the most notorious woman in the United States. She was born February 20th, 1805. Grimke was an abolitionist, a political activist, and a supporter of the women's suffrage movement, a movement that attempted to secure a woman's right to vote. Angelina and her sister Sarah were considered the only notable examples of white Southern women abolitionists. You talk about bucking the tide. You talk about standing when standing wasn't popular. The Grimke sisters, they are perfect symbols of standing, oftentimes alone. Standing, friends, is rarely convenient. Standing is rarely popular. Standing often comes with a hefty price. Here's an example. May 17th, 1838, 2 days after being married to abolitionist Theodore Well, Angelina Grimke was speaking at a racially integrated abolitionist gathering in Philadelphia. As she was speaking, an unruly mob outside grew more and more agitated, became aggressive. They began shouting threats. Instead of stopping her speech, Grimke continued, incorporating their interruptions into her speech, saying, among other things, quote, "You deluded beings, you know not what you do," end quote. Despite the rioters outside the building, who by now were throwing bricks and stones and breaking all the windows of the hall, Grimke kept going. She refused to quit. Grimke kept standing. She concluded her speech, left the hall arm in arm with a white woman and a black woman. Friends, it would be the last speech in Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia. For within hours upon the conclusion of the speech, the hall was destroyed by arson. But the spirit of Angelina Grimke, making a decision to stand, could not be extinguished. Despite mounting opposition from Southern slaveholders and Northerners who wanted to maintain the status quo, Grimke continued. She continued opposing slavery and advocating a woman's right to vote. Because one woman made a choice to stand, a generation of women found the courage to stand. Grimke made a major contribution to America's historical record, not just in protest, but literature as well. Worth the read is her article titled "An Appeal to the Christian Woman of the South." It was published in 1836, the only written appeal made by a Southern woman to other Southern women regarding the abolishment of slavery. Grimke argued in that article that slavery was contrary to the Declaration of Independence, that slavery was contrary to the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, that slavery was contrary to the first charter of human rights bestowed upon man in the Bible. Arguably, one woman who chose to stand may very well have inspired a future civil rights leader who delivered a speech 100 years later with a very similar tone. In one of the mass meetings to support the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who challenged America to resist the chains of racial oppression with words reflective of Grimke's plea a century earlier. In fact, I can hear King's words ringing in my heart with a piercing familiarity. King said on this particular occasion, "If we're wrong, the Supreme Court is wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we're wrong, God Almighty is wrong." Even as her health failed, Angelina Grimke kept standing. At home, she and Sister Sarah began a school, and later a boarding school where they taught the children of other abolitionists, including a student named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would later team up with Susan B. Anthony to establish the Women's Loyal National League to campaign for the abolition of slavery. They also were the two main organizers of the American Equal Rights Association, which campaigned for the equality for both African Americans as well as women. Stanton that child taught by Angelina Grimke, would become president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. You see, friends, making a choice to stand will offer two immediate benefits. First, you discover a new depth of courage. During peaceful times, during times of convenience, when life appears certain and balanced and things seem to be going well, little demand is placed on our courage. But when you face difficult times, when you face times of uncertainty, when everybody else is saying, I don't know if it can be done, I don't think it's possible, and you make a choice to stand, you'll find a capacity for courage that is simply unimaginable. Second, those around you will be affected by you standing, and they'll be affected in dramatic ways. In other words, courage is contagious. We're inspired by acts of courage all the time, inspired by people who make a choice to stand regardless. We love watching them in movies. In fact, I just highlight a couple of movies about people who stood against facing insurmountable odds. They found the courage to stand, and they inspired countless others. Just think about these movies. Perhaps you've seen some of them. Rudy, the football story, the story of an overachiever in the classroom and on the football field at Notre Dame. How about Sully, the real-life story of Sully Sullenberger, the pilot who lands his plane on the Hudson? How about the movie Hidden Figures, these Negro women working against all odds in the 50s and in the 60s at NASA? How about Russell Crowe in the movie The Gladiator? Starts off as a Roman general, falls into slavery, and literally and figuratively has to fight his way back to restore his honor. There's a famous quote by the character he played, Maximum. He said, "What we do in life echoes in eternity." I hope and pray that you will take a stand regardless of the obstacles, regardless of whether it's popular or convenient, that you'll take a stand. One of my favorite movies is Braveheart, Mel Gibson, a Scottish warrior, William Wallace, who led his countrymen into a rebellion to free his country from the tyranny of King Edward I in England. Famous William Wallace quote that epitomizes standing. Every man dies, but not every man truly lives. Friends, when you stand, you are living. For if you have nothing to die for, you have nothing to live for. And seeing other people stand, it fills us with hope. It electrifies our spirit. It compels us to act on our own accord. We demand the courage to face our fear. We move forward. We take a giant step forward instead of remaining paralyzed. Winston Churchill said on one occasion, "Fear is a reaction, but courage is a choice." When we stand, we place a demand upon our spirit not to quit. When we stand, we impact all those around us. When we stand, our convictions are strengthened. We speak and act based on values and beliefs. When we stand, our resilience grows, our influence grows. It was John Maxwell who said, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. When we stand, we communicate to our brain that we're not quitting, that we're not giving up, that we're digging deep with a resolve that may have eluded us previously. When we stand, we become relentless, resilient, influential. When we stand, others are affected and influenced to do the very same. They see in our lives the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they can keep going as well. So friends, what lesson can be more profitable than simply making a decision this very day to stand? Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Until we meet again, this is Dr. Rick asking the most important question I can ask. How you living?
Are you ready to make an impact in your world right now? Do you want to stop existing and start living your best life right now? Dr. Rick wants to give you the first chapter of his best-selling book, Lessons from a Third Grade Dropout, absolutely free. Just go to www.rickrigsby.com/free gift to get the print or audiobook right now.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.